they're back in Memphis in the summer of 1928, John receives a wire asking him to go on the road with a territory band. Territory bands are a big part of the development of jazz, and they were mostly in the Southwest, where basically they were different from East Coast bands or bands in Chicago, where they were pretty much on the road all the time and not necessarily recording and developing their own regional styles of music. So John gets an offer to go to Oklahoma City to join this band led by a trumpet player named Terrence Holder. Mary Lou stays behind in Memphis. John says, I'll let you know if it works out. And Mary Lou has her first opportunity to become a band leader because John had been leading a combo, an 8-piece group in Memphis, and they still have gigs on the books. So Mary Lou has to take over the band. So already she's learning these early things. She's like 17 years old at this point, of how to take care of all the things of running a band, from hoping everyone shows up on time, to paying them, to securing performances. Mary Lou also talks about when she did a lot of her interviews and writings, she really glosses over a lot of things, but one thing that I find particularly scary came from this period. So she's alone now. She starts having solo engagements where she has to take a trolley to the end of a line and then wait for someone to come pick her up and drive her to a roadhouse to play a solo gig. And she talks about how scared she is. She usually doesn't, but there's one particular interview where she said that while she was driving, she had never heard so many people yelling the word nigger in her life. And she had not been used to hearing this because even though she faced a certain prejudice in Pittsburgh, Memphis is a lot further south. And it was a place where a lot of musicians came to on their way trying to get further north. But after she's hearing this, she just tries to keep her mouth shut. She gets to this gig. She has patrons giving her their phone numbers, they're on cards or writing them down. And after several of these gigs, the owner of this roadhouse comes to her and says, don't come back for a while. Because one of these men, who was from the nearby state of Mississippi, had offered the cook $50 to abduct Mary Lou, to take him back to his home in Mississippi. So Mary Lou ends that gig. But it's moments like this that just really make me wonder what she had to go through on an ongoing basis. So soon after this, after she's been in Memphis for about 2 or 3 months on her own with John, her husband, in Oklahoma City, John says, come to Oklahoma, the band is working out there. So Mary drives about 700 miles. She describes her car as a red bathtub of a Chevrolet. She says every 40 or 50 miles, she's with John's mother and one of John's mother's friends, I believe. And Mary Lou is the only one who knows how to fix things like changing the carburetor. So she's having to deal with this. She gets to Oklahoma City very early in the morning and goes to hear the band's rehearsal and gets there very early. And she's very impressed. Another thing about Mary Lou that I don't really understand. She's very impressed by how professional she describes the musicians as being, because she says they're reading music. But she also talks about how you can't learn music just from sheet music, from reading it. She wants to play in the group, but she's there to support her husband. And there's no place for her because there's already a pianist in the band named Marion Jackson. So also around this time, this band becomes very important in Mary Lou's life because she later plays with them. But the trumpet player, Terrence Holder, who was the band leader, was not so good with money. There's various stories. He gambles away some of the band's salaries, and the band says, we don't want you anymore. So they decide to have their tuba player, Andy Kirk, become the leader. And Andy Kirk renames the group as Andy Kirk and his 12 Clouds of Joy. They actually are a very major big band in the development of jazz. You may have heard of people like Count Basie or Duke Ellington, or perhaps Fletcher Henderson. Andy Kirk's band was essentially right up there with them. So after this, the band relocates to Tulsa, and John and Mary move in an apartment above an undertaker. Mary Lou has nothing to do except go and hear this band. So she decides with her free time to drive a hearse for the undertaker. She always said she was a good driver, so this is what she does. And it's scary kind of reading about some of these experiences. After she's in Oklahoma for about 6 months, her beloved stepfather, Fletcher Burley, dies, so she goes back to Pittsburgh. And I actually think that this is a time, she again doesn't talk about it a lot, but I think it was a big break for her from her husband, because she later finds out that her husband has never wanted her to go out and socialize, and he says it's because he doesn't want her to drink too much, but actually she finds out that he's seeing someone else. So being back in Pittsburgh with her family is almost a relief for her. She also just is able to actually perform there because she already knows people there. But Andy Kirk's band comes through Pittsburgh on a one-nighter, and John says, gotta come back with us. So Mary Lou does. The good news is that they don't go back to Oklahoma. They now go to Kansas City, which is a city that Mary Lou described as a heavenly city with music everywhere and 50 or more cabarets rocking on a 6-block radius. Mary Lou also talks about this. She says most of the night spots were run by politicians and hoodlums, and the town was wide open for drinking, gambling, and pretty much every form of vice. Naturally, work was plentiful for musicians. Now, and it's actually true. So I wish I could have tons of time to talk about Kansas City, but there's a distinct style of jazz that develops there that's very separate from New York. And part of the reason this happens is because of sort of the political milieu that's there, and the mayor, Tom Pendergast, who's basically a political hoodlum. He's a political boss, and he allows just kind of anything to happen. Andy Kirk, with his band, he actually says that when 1929 and the great stock market crash happens and the Great Depression starts, that it was like a pin drop happening in Kansas City because everyone just kept going out partying. And nothing changed there. So this is actually a period of time where Kansas City has a lot of clubs where Mary Lou's able to go out after hours and start going to jam sessions where musicians play into the wee hours of the morning. So even though she's not in Andy Kirk's band, she's getting known as being this really great piano player. She hears people like Count Basie, Benny Moten, who was another pianist who had an early swing era band. And she's basically just getting a lot more notice and soaking in a lot. She's also wanting to write music. Now remember, she doesn't read music. So how is she going to write music? But she hears everything. So Andy Kirk is actually a big part of Mary Lou's story because he comes alongside her, and every day he spends time with her, helping her to write down what she hears. He also shows her scores of music they're doing from different arrangers so that she can learn how to write music for 3 saxophones or 3 trumpets. And so he actually helps her to develop her own unique arranging style. We're actually going to listen to a piece, the first piece, original composition, that Mary Lou recorded with Andy Kirk. And this is from November of 1929, and it's called Mesa Stomp. Mesa was the nickname that her stepfather had given to her. So we're just going to listen to a few seconds of this. banjo in there, right? I'm just cutting these things off, unfortunately, because we won't have time. This is something that you actually can find on iTunes, but I'm going to show you here what Andy Kirk's band eventually looks like. You see that Mary Lou is playing piano now. So she was playing on the 1929 recording, and this is actually before she's in the band, so this is a really interesting story. So the regular pianist, Marion Jackson, didn't show up for an audition. There were two record executives from Chicago who come to Kansas City, and they are looking to record another band they will feel will rival Benny Moten's. Benny Moten is another swing era band leader. And in this era, there was something called race records. So it was a series of records that record labels would put out. They might have a series called Popular Series, and then they would have a race record series, which was meant to be targeting African American listeners. However, it was usually white record label executives who were deciding what the African American audiences would want to hear. So Andy Kirk, who is there on the right holding the baton, he talks about, in his autobiography, he talks about his frustration because this group was playing in a lot of ballrooms. This was another big part of this era, like the Savoy Ballroom in New York, where they were playing mostly for all white audiences because the audiences were not allowed to mix. But then there would be one night a week where the ballroom would have a night where African Americans could come and they would play the same music. So there's this whole dichotomy between what's called hot music, which gets associated with race as African American music, and sweet music, which is supposed to be more melodic, more waltzes, and that gets associated as being white music. And Andy Kirk says that his band was actually more too white sounding for some of these record labels, and he can't get them to record what he wants to do because they want to hear what they've decided is going to be popular for a certain market. Now, on this recording we just heard, so back up, Marion Jackson was supposed to play on the record. He doesn't show up. Andy Kirk doesn't know what to do. And John, Mary's husband, says, "Why don't you get my wife? You know she's a great piano player." So Andy relents, and Mary comes in and plays on this composition as well as on about 5 others. And the crazy thing is that Andy Kirk had already been playing this particular tune with his band. It's Mary's tune, but she wasn't playing on the gigs. She gets to play on the recording, though. And these 2 record execs from Chicago want Mary to then play on a record deal that they offer to the band. So the following year, I'll show you one more picture of them. The following year, in 1930, Andy Kirk has been touring with his group. He takes them to Chicago, and they've got this record deal with Brunswick. And they go into the studio, but even though Mary played on that first recording, she's not with the band yet. She's back home in Kansas City while the band is touring. They get to the studio in Chicago, and the record exec says, "Where's the girl? We liked her style." So he tells Andy Kirk, "You got to get Mary Lou, or else we're not doing the record." So Mary Lou takes a train up from Kansas City. She again has a pretty scary story where there's an attempted rape on the train as she tries to get up to Chicago. And she arrives in town actually a couple days before they do the full band takes. And she just sits down at the piano and improvises 2 pieces that, unbeknownst to her, were being recorded at the time. And we're going to listen to one of those pieces. This is called Nightlife. just cutting it off, and I hate doing this. If any of you want this playlist, which I've also put a lot of it on YouTube, I'm happy to share it afterwards so you can go back and check any of this music out, because it's very painful to have to just shut it off. What's important about this recording, too, is that Mary Lou is showing, and this is kind of something that happened throughout her life, that she was able to assimilate different styles of music, but also make it her own. So you hear her doing these things with her left hand where she's just jumping up and down between a low note and a chord. That's called stride piano. And then she starts varying things up with the rhythm in her left hand, which make the piece sound very different. But it's something that you feel like she doesn't need a band, basically. I mean, you can sit here and just snap on 2 and 4 without the bass player and the drummer. And she was really known for having an amazing, we call it a sense of time, like more than just a metronomic sense of time, but something that you feel in your whole body that makes you want to move, which essentially is what swing is. So I'm going to play for you now, myself, one of Mary Lou's tunes that became a hit for the Andy Kirk Band. So after this 1930 session, Mary Lou, records about 10 pieces with the band on this session. She's still not in the band. So the band actually keeps touring. Mary Lou is still not the pianist. They get to a gig in Philadelphia, and guess what happens? Marian Jackson, the pianist, doesn't show up again. So there's various theories as what he was doing, why he didn't make it. But Mary Lou she's again there. She actually got to play a couple of gigs there where Andy Kirk had the 2 pianists playing, and she said she had to play a tom thumb piano while Marian Jackson played, like the Steinway or something. I doubt it was a Steinway, but a grand piano. But then she basically got to graduate to being the band's pianist because Marian doesn't show up. So this is in 1931, and from 1931 until 1942, Mary Lou is the regular pianist and arranger in Kirk's band. Now, the piece I'm going to play for you right now is something that became a hit that she composed for Andy Kirk, but it also became a hit for another band led by Jimmy Lunsford, who was another great saxophonist and swing-era band leader. Many people recorded it. Mary Lou, later on in her career, she fought for the rights to this tune because not all of the copyright issues were taken care of, and she later claimed, and I think she's right, that someone else lifted 16 bars of her piece and incorporated it into what is now a jazz standard called Black Coffee, which maybe some of you have heard. But this piece, part of the reason it became a hit for Andy Kirk's band as well is because Kirk started using vocalists on his record. This is something that happens in the late 30s, and it's something that the record execs didn't want to do because they thought African Americans are not going to buy this record. Well, as soon as they start having vocalists, the band actually reaches the top of the hit parade with several tunes in 1938, and one of the tunes is What's Your Story? Morning Glory, which I'm going to play for you now. Oh, we're going to skip ahead to the 1940s. So Mary Lou leaves Andy Kirk's band in 1942. She says that she walks off a bus, whether or not that's exactly what happened. She was on the road with Kirk when she just decides she needs to be doing more musically. And as the band is kind of going into playing more sweet music where improvisation is not as big a part of the music that's played, or where she can do arrangements that are as adventurous as she wants to, she decides she just needs to do something different. So she also has recently divorced her husband, John, married a trumpet player who was in the band at the time named Harold Shorty Baker, and they go to Pittsburgh for a brief bit of time, but I'm going to skip to what happens when she goes to New York later on in 1942. So Mary Lou, now she is, that's actually a great book I found at the New York Public Library. It's amazing to see in the 1930s and 40s, there was kind of, I think there was this craze. People wanted to play what they considered to be boogie woogie, and Mary Lou's music was not exactly that. It was a little more advanced, but this is a cover from a 1940s boogie woogie book. So in 1942, when Mary Lou moves to New York, she gets a small apartment in Harlem, and she starts forming her own small groups. She plays at one place in Greenwich Village that becomes a very central part of music and kind of bohemian life and also politics, called Cafe Society. And she also has her own radio show on WNEW called the Mary Lou Williams Piano Workshop, where she's able to improvise pieces that she later starts using for more extended works, and this is one of them.